The boardroom was a glass box that tasted of polished oak and citrus cologne, a place designed to impress and hush. Outside, the city moved in jagged rhythms, the scrape of buses, the distant siren wail, somebody's radio playing a tinny jazz standard at a deli. Inside, Ashcroft Holdings' top floor held its own weather. The soft, rehearsed laughter of investors, the clack of leather briefcases, the low hum of a projector that never quite warmed to the room's glare. Bernard James Kellerman had been sweeping these floors for years. He knew every scuff along the baseboard, every smug crease in the carpet where chairs always left footprints, and the precise slot in his jacket where the faded photograph of his daughter slid in and out. He was used to being a shadow in bright rooms, a man whose work went unnoticed until something went wrong. That afternoon, his shadow stepped into the light. It began with a sound no one wanted to hear, a woman's breath snatch, the chair's squeal as the CEO's hand slipped from its armrest. For a moment, nothing registered, the slide of fingertips along mahogany, wine glass tilting, the rustle of a silk blouse. Then the room rotated into panic. A body folded like a drawing taken by hand. Bernard reacted before he thought. Years of mopping lines and gathering scattered pens had trained him to move without deliberation when a thing needed doing. He crossed the room in 2 strides, sleeves rolled, sneakers whispering across the expensive flooring. People made space, not reverent, not even polite. They recoiled like a hydrangea from frost. Bernard knelt. He checked for a pulse, the telltale flatness. He shouted for someone to call 911 and to clear the room, kept his voice steady even as his heart beat against his ribs like an animal trapped in a chest. Alexandra Ashcroft's face, usually composed like a headline, was a stranger's now, pale, with an athlete's exhaustion around the jawline that no amount of airbrushed press could remove. Bernard's hands went to work because they had to. He had learned a skill in a different kind of emergency, a neighbor's child choking on a grape, a man collapsing on a subway platform once. He had not trained for boardroom grandeur, but he knew compressions, the press and release cadence that would buy time. He kept the beat with a focus so physical it left thought behind. A woman screamed. Someone shouted for paramedics. A man in a suit shoved through the circle of observers and barked, "Get him away, get him out of here." It was not a plea for procedure. It was a reflex toward containment. Bernard didn't stop. He pressed, breathed, counted. The room tightened into a tunnel of shoes and perfume. The CEO's eyes fluttered, unfocused. Then something like recognition flickered. Her fingers flailed and closed on nothing, on the air between them, and then the machine that is the human body answered. Paramedics pushed into the room, compact, efficient, indifferent to class.
They took over with polite abrasiveness, lifting, checking, rolling her to a stretcher. Bernard's hands came free. He stood awkward in a place where he usually had a mop. A woman in an expensive coat asked, because people ask everything when they wanted absolution, "Did you? What happened?" Bernard said what he had done, the simple truth. "I did compressions. I kept her breathing." His voice carried, strange and small against the room's hum. For a breathless hour, the company behaved like a patient at a hospital, coordinated, procedural, efficient. They called ambulances. They penned statements. They managed the optics, the way a gardener trims the visible leaves while roots go unexamined. And then something happened that Bernard could not have expected. A photograph, a single frozen frame from the chaos, made its way out of the room and into the world. It wasn't a picture of heroics. It was a slice of motion impossible to neutralize. A security cam's grayscale that caught Bernard kneeling at the edge of the table, hands on Alexandra while her head lolled, her shirt disarranged by the movement, a lock of hair fallen across her face. The angle cropped context like a bad editor. In the wrong set of hands, a life-saving posture could be read as impropriety. Someone, somewhere, cut the frame loose and it slid into the cold river of online attention. When the image reached the public feed, it landed with the force of judgment. The headline didn't say, "Janitor saves CEO." It asked a different question in a tone that made certainty sound like accusation. Rumor moved faster than facts. Rumor was always in better shape for the camera. Bernard watched it happen on a colleague's phone, while a PR manager murmured about damage control. He had been doing what he could, and the world returned him with suspicion. The company moved like a machine trained to protect itself. An internal review opened, access revoked, and finally a terse letter handed in an HR meeting that had been scheduled and rehearsed, and therefore unmistakably cold. Termination, effective immediately. They did not say, "We are sorry." They did not say, "Thank you." They said procedures and policies, and the delicate language of liability. Bernard signed the paper with hands that had cleaned and steadied for years. Molly would need school uniforms come fall. The radiator was starting to cough in their small apartment. There were names on waiting lists and phone calls that claimed no openings. There was a photograph of a girl and a father, and it was all he had to show for the life he kept. Outside the building, sunlight split off the glass in bright, hard knives. Reporters gathered, as they always did, because scandal is a magnet and a cash register at once. Someone offered a question about the incident. Someone else supplied a whisper that spread like oil on water. A neighbor filmed Bernard as he came down the service stair. He kept his head down.
He kept his jacket off, the scent of perfume and power that clung to the floors he had polished. He did not go home to braced silence. He went home to Molly. She was 8, small and furious in the way of small defenders who do not yet understand weight. She had an overactive imagination and a habit of misplacing socks. Bernard used to joke that she was a future politician. She could make an argument with the solemnity of a magistrate. That night, she made lemonade in a chipped mug and set 2 plastic plates on the table for a dinner of whatever was cheap and edible. Janet Holloway lived across the hall and kept sugar and gossip in equal measure. Janet had been a nurse and had seen enough collapses and crises to know the sort of quiet they leave behind. She'd kept Bernard's schedule in her head for years, the rhythm of his life marked by janitorial rounds and community soccer practices. She'd also stood in line on winter nights to hold Molly while Bernard took on double shifts. Janet's presence was not mercy in a headline way. She was a neighbor who fed and listened. "Don't tell me you're not tired," she said, pouring tea like an accusation wrapped in kindness. "I'm tired," Bernard admitted, "but it doesn't matter. She's breathing because of me." Molly's eyes, round and serious, looked at him like she was taking the measure of a man who had done something enormous. "They say on TV it looked bad," she said, "and the smallness of television in its box could not shelter the cruelty it could visit. They say you did something wrong." Bernard let out a breath that might have been a laugh if laughter hadn't failed him. "They're news," he said. "They don't always get it right." He tried to keep the bitterness out of the sentence. He tried, too, to keep it from Molly, because her ledger of trust needed him to be the one who kept the books balanced. The smear's effect rippled through the community the way an unkind rumor does. It stuck to doorways, it changed faces, it altered service. For a man whose work was visibility in its absence, being seen a suspect branded him in other people's eyes. Letters arrived in the mailboxes of Bernard's employer, notifying tenants of restructuring. People who had once nodded when passing him in corridors now averted their glance. At a job fair in a municipal gym, Brian, an old friend from the building's maintenance floor, slid over a pamphlet and a look that asked without speaking whether Bernard wanted a temp gig. The centers were full of people whose dignity was in question. Bernard filled out forms with the steady hand of someone who had been asked many times in his life to prove he was useful. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table and mapped out budgets on scrap paper. He calculated how many shifts he could pick up at the university parking lot, how many hours of overtime would pay for Molly's winter coat. Meanwhile, the company's boardroom buzzed in a different register. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, moved like an answering machine, efficient, programmed, and cold. He smelled of certainty and money. Tyler saw the frame only in the terms of threat assessment. "We can't have perception-damaging stakeholder trust," he said in a meeting where every person wore a practiced face. Containment was his modality. The easiest way to calm the storm, he argued, was to remove the potential liability while the legal team drafted the official release. Fiona Redford, Alexandra's assistant, sat across from him with her lips pressed thin. She had the kind of loyalty that was born of long days and close work, but she also had a moral string attached to things, not a habit of heroics, but the habit of noticing. She'd watched Bernard in the room, watched hands that didn't hesitate, filings that had been set down and left in the rush. Her job had been to shield mistakes from the public eye. Now shielding looked like a small betrayal. "We should at least talk to him," she said, mostly to herself. "We should hear his side." Tyler's laugh was a small thing that shredded the suggestion. "With respect, Fiona, we contain. We minimize litigation exposure. This is about governance as much as optics. You know how investors react to complications." In an office that cost more than Bernard's building, the conversation was about balance sheets, not people. Words like precedent and risk mitigation moved across glossy pages, while a man who had saved a life found himself declared a precedent. Alexandra was a different kind of listener. She sat in her recovery suite later, the buzz of the city below distant and irrelevant. The hospital had wrapped her in white linen in clinical punctuation. Tests had shown an arrhythmia, an episode of electrical misfiring in a heart accustomed to pushing forward. She had been discharged with bland instructions in cigarettes that she promised to quit, and a doctor's look that was part concern and part inventory. The collapse left a rub of human fragility against a life built to be unshakable. For someone accustomed to being read as efficiency and achievement, there was no manual for being seen as a body in need. At first, she did what powerful people often do. She let staff manage the narrative. Briefings came to her phone. "We're handling it. We've issued a statement. We'll be transparent." Her calendar filled with calls she sometimes cut short, because there was as much noise as there was content in the sound of other people's tasks. But the image that had leaked slid under her skin. She saw herself, out of motion, out of control, captured in a monochrome that stripped away the rituals of power. She noticed the way the world made an otherwise life-or-death episode into a scandal, how a single image could be weaponized. At night she woke with her palms damp, a worry she'd never had before, not for her health, but for the man whose hands had kept her alive. She'd been told to let the PR team lead.
She'd been told that is how a leader protects the organization that depends on them. But Fiona's quiet face in the corner of the briefing, the fact that someone had pushed a frame into circulation, not an official still, but a slice of movement posted by an anonymous account, began to nag. Alexandra started to turn the world inward for a second, toward cause and consequence rather than shareholder value alone. There was a person in the story, not just a risk profile. The smear crept through neighborhoods like mold. Bernard found that small businesses he had buffed for years suddenly had no openings. The landlord at his building, practical with the merciless pragmatics of someone who had to keep the pipes running, met him with a letter about immediate lease review and circumstances beyond our standard occupancy guidelines. The letter was polite. It did not throw someone into the street, but it held the threat of a slow squeeze. Janet did what she could. She hosted a potluck and invited building residents, old friends, anyone who would keep Bernard and Molly in sight. At the table, talk roamed around debt and the weather and the city's bus routes. There was a moment of real tenderness when Molly, drawing on a paper placement, wrote, "My dad is a hero" in big, solemn letters, then looked up to find Bernard's face folded in relief and sorrow at once. Bernard tried not to watch the headlines, but he watched them because they seemed to pulse against his life like a second heartbeat. He walked the city at dusk, bag slung over his shoulder, thinking about what it meant to be a man who was suddenly both visible and denigrated. He had always believed that work had dignity. He clung to that belief because it kept him from despair. The social feed, vicious, precise, made short work of personhood. Animations looped, eyebrows raised, captions judged. Strangers who had never met him pronounced on his character as if they knew the ledger. A local station interviewed a talking head who spoke in generalities about unchecked behavior in workplaces. The PR machine countered with a statement. "Ashcroft Holdings does not tolerate impropriety of any kind. We have commissioned an internal review." The words were meant to reassure investors and to throw a line into the public sea. They did not, however, name specifics. They did not say, "We are grateful to the man who saved a life." Fiona watched this unfold with an increasing sense of unease. She knew the machine from inside, how it could devour nuance. She also knew Bernard had spoken plainly in the room that afternoon. That memory, his hands, the rhythm, stayed with her. In her cube, after the emails and the short, controlled briefings, she replayed the fragment of footage she had seen on the security feed earlier, the broad strokes of movement before the frame got cropped and fed to 1,000 hungry devices. She wondered which set of decisions had allowed a single frame to become accusation.
Tyler's reply was to tighten. "We have to assume the worst-case scenario," he told the board, in language that made it sound like he was planning for a storm, not compounding one. There was money in preparedness, after all. Profits were measurable, human damage less so. It was in those quiet contradictions that Alexandra began to feel a tug she couldn't name. When she walked past her office window and saw the city, it looked less like a landscape of conquest and more like a tapestry of people with small, stubborn lives. She had been raised to assume that power included the right to decide. That right now felt bleached. One night she woke in the middle of the night to an image in her mind, a man's hands on her ribs, a rhythm given, a life held. She reached for her phone and, in a restless, almost involuntary way, pulled up the company's security system. The footage loaded shakily on a private server. She watched, not the cropped frame that had done damage, but the longer reel. The more she watched, the more the narrative the world had created unraveled into something simpler and harder. Bernard's hands were straight and clean in their intent. He had not hesitated. She closed the laptop because the lights had made it hard to see the grain. She told herself she was tired, but the next day she found her mind returning to the scene between email subject lines. She felt ashamed in a way she had not anticipated, for being the center of an image that could be manipulated, yes, but also for being the beneficiary of a decision that had so easily deemed another man disposable. People at the company were concerned about reputational fallout. She began to feel concerned about moral fallout. The smear campaign worked in ways that the board could measure. Investor calls were buffered, the media cycle cooled to a dull itch. But for a man without a safety net, the consequences were immediate and harsh. Bernard watched as opportunities closed one after another. He did side work, small fixes, the occasional odd job at a shuttered laundromat, but those were irregular and underpaid. At night, he lay on a small couch in a one-bedroom apartment with Molly, and the city's noise pressed on the window pane like a hand trying to get in. There were small humiliations. A woman in a copy shop refused to let him use the employee restroom. A father at a school pickup line muttered when he heard Bernard's name. In the world where being seen as suspect made you less than previous, he found himself decorated with a new identity he had not chosen. Some days Bernard kept his head down and focused on the practical, where to get cheap boots for Molly, what groceries would stretch. Other days anger rose like floodwater. He thought about the woman he had kept alive and how quickly hands could be recategorized into a liability. He imagined a scale where actions were measured not by life saved, but by who had power to write the ledger.
But beneath the anger, he carried a quieter weight, the worry of being unable to sleep through Molly's nightmares, of being unable to explain why their lives had shifted. He could not tell her all the intricacies of how media and money worked. He had to keep stories small and steady for a child whose world needed to make sense. So when Molly asked if he was still brave, he said yes. He did not tell her about the phone with a picture of a still frame that had become a weapon. In the days after his firing, Bernard moved like a man between two currents, one of family and the other of public scrutiny. He went to the shelter board to see if there were any referrals for temporary housing. The woman behind the desk was sympathetic but professional, like all people paid to hold other people's emergencies. There were forms and waiting lists and the steady calendar of people who could help, which in practice meant length in process. Alexandra, by contrast, held her own private storm. She kept meaning to call someone, her father, perhaps, or an old mentor, but she found herself reaching instead for the security console. She wanted to see more of what had happened, to uncrop the narrative. At night, when the building dropped to murmurs and the lights in the city blurred, she found herself watching the footage again and again until it went from being a document to a small, private truth she had to reconcile with. A week into the fallow aftermath, a local outlet posted a piece that used the cropped frame as its centerpiece. The headline begged for clicks. Commenters piled on with indignation. The post, anonymous and gleeful, suggested that the CEO had been victimized by an overfamiliar employee. The company's PR team hurried in the way of damage control, template statements, legal phrases, an attorney's voice like sandpaper. Behind the polished statements, decisions were being made. People like Bernard became an easy object to remove from the narrative because he lived on the margins and because marginal people are easiest to lose. Fiona, who had watched the whole messy human machine from its underbelly, did not like how cleanly the story had been closed. She began a small, quiet investigation of the internal feeds, old footage, timestamps, access logs. She gathered nothing like an ironclad case. She had intuition and curiosity. At her desk one evening, as the rest of the office emptied, she opened a file and sent a note to herself. Who authorized the leak? It was more a personal protest than a production of evidence, yet small acts can start avalanches if you stack enough of them. There were conversations behind closed doors. We need to be decisive, Tyler said. Anything that can be seen as a vulnerability is a cost. He proposed a press line that would emphasize policy adherence and no tolerance for workplace breaches, the language of institutions that function like armor.
It made the CEO's absence from the center of the conversation feel more official than it should have. It made Bernard's presence in the world less necessary in the eyes that mattered. Bernard's friends rallied the only way they could. Brian collected signatures for a petition to rehire. He posted messages defending the man they all knew. There were small demonstrations at the building's entrance, people with handmade signs who had never imagined themselves in protest. They did not move markets, but they moved the neighborhood. They made people who had thought of Bernard as background check him in the way neighbors sometimes do. The sign meant little to the reporters who filmed it, but it meant a lot to a man whose life had been reduced to a caption. At home, Molly slept with the photograph of the two of them, Bernard's arms around her, both of them laughing at some private joke. It was a truer photograph than any of the ones the press posted. Bernard kept that image tucked in his wallet, like a compass. He rubbed the crease between his fingers when nights were long. The narrative outside their apartment continued. The anonymous poster rode the waves of outrage, and, perversely, of sympathy. The internet had a way of making the private public and public private in the same breath. Bernard found himself facing the new reality of how stories could be stolen from the people who lived them. And yet, other people were awake to the truth. On a gray Thursday, Fiona printed a still from the full security footage and placed it in a folder on her desk. It was not the cropped frame that had gone viral. This one showed more context: the commotion on the boardroom floor, the paramedic's legs, the coffee table knocked askew. It showed hands doing the steady work of a rescue. She left the folder in a place she hoped would be noticed, on Alexandra's assistant's first chair, where someone might sit and see it. Alexandra found the print when she was alone. There was no script for how a person with so much outward certainty managed the feeling that came with seeing a different angle of a filmed life. She turned the paper over like a relic, then opened her laptop, and, against what she had been advised, against the sanitized narrative prepared by the PR team, she watched the footage again in her quiet office. The movement carried no suggestion apart from the one that mattered. Bernard had kept her alive. That night she dreamed of a room full of hands, all reaching, some to help and some to hold others down. She woke with a dry throat and a name on her lips no boardroom could cleanse: Bernard. There was a long list of practicalities she could hide behind: legal counsel, corporate policy, the risk of perverse incentives. These were all true statements, but they sat next to a simpler, more human one. A man had saved her life. If the company had erred in its response, if the board had been more concerned with image than fact, would she accept that and move on?
The question tasted like a moral calculus she had not signed up for. Back in the neighborhood, Bernard's days folded into a sequence of small necessities. He cleaned Adeli's back room for a few hours one afternoon, mopped floors at a dental office another. He showed up at interviews with a clean shirt and the jarred calm of a man who had learned to make his life fit into whatever space the world gave him. None of those jobs paid the bills. None of them restored what the smear had taken, the quiet sense that his work mattered in the eyes of others. Then one evening, as rain rattled the window and the building's heater coughed in the corridor, Bernard opened his email to see a single message: "Request for you to come in for a meeting. Facilities consultation. Ashcroft Holdings." He read it twice. The sender was an address he recognized only as corporate. His first thought was that perhaps it was a mistake. His second thought was of Molly's cough and the rent. There was a clause about temporary engagement and about an administrative matter. He felt the old muscle memory of work flex in him, like a hand closing around a mop. He told Janet at the corner shop that he had been contacted. Janet offered a look that said caution and a little disbelief. "Be careful," she told him. "People can bait you with a job. Don't get yourself in a place where you're used and thrown." Bernard smiled with a bruise in his chest. "I know," he said. He also felt the fierce, oddly tender weight of wanting to do work for its own sake. If the company wanted to call him in to clean the annex, he would accept. He had always believed the simplest contracts were the most honest, exchange of labor for pay. But there was another sense, quieter, that this could be something else, a chance to be seen by the people who had watched from their glass towers and never imagined the man who kept their floors clean. Word of the request leaked in small ways. Fiona's eyes, when they met his at the reception door, held a measure of apology. She could not speak for the company that had dismissed him, but she could, in small gestures, try to set things right. "It's a temporary thing," she said, the sentence both an explanation and a shield. "They want help with facilities. They're clearing a spot for someone to work on the annex." Bernard accepted the temporary engagement because he had to. He accepted because he wanted to stay close to the truth of that day, the truth of what his hands had done. When he signed in at the security desk, the woman behind it did not meet his eye the way she had before. People were learning to be careful again. He had no idea what his return would reveal. He did not expect reparations. He expected a paycheck and a chance to study a life. But the universe, strictly practical, composed of meetings and emails, sometimes produces unexpected turns.
On his second day back in the building, a small glitch with a printer in an executive corridor nudged him into something that would change the trajectory of both their lives. It was a printer that refused to talk to the network. Papers groaned and jammed. An assistant cursed softly and called for IT. IT was overloaded. Bernard had fixed printers before. He knew where the rollers threw tantrums and where a bit of elbow grease could coax them into compliance. He knelt on the polished floor, popped open the right panel, eased a misbehaving tray back into place, and pressed the button. The printer whirred like a small animal waking. It coughed and spat a sheet that had been stuck, an internal memo perhaps, or something mundane. The assistant thanked him without thinking, the way people thank the automatic and invisible work that keeps offices functioning. He straightened and stood in the corridor, belts of afternoon light cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At the far end of the hall, an office door was ajar. Alexandra had been keeping unusual hours, and she sat at her desk, a laptop open to a screensaver that glowed softly. She had not yet made a public statement. She had not yet decided how much personal responsibility she would take, how public the reparation would be. The company's lawyers recommended restraint. Her conscience recommended otherwise. Bernard noticed the laptop because he had been taught by necessity to notice small things: loose screws, humidifiers that needed water, a coffee cup left to stain the wood. The screen was stuck on an image, a photograph cropped to be a wallpaper, an image of Alexandra some years younger, laughing into a camera that caught something candid and unposed. It was not the kind of public image the press used. It was private in the way a photograph becomes private, because the subject had allowed a softer version of themselves to be visible. He stepped closer because of a human curiosity that is not rude. It is a byproduct of shared space and the knowing of a job that requires you to be near the things people leave behind. The photo was unobtrusive, sunlight in hair, a smile so full it reached the eyes. For a person used to uniforms and routine, that smile had the power of a small revelation. Alexandra looked up at the sound of movement, and for a moment, the two of them were in the same quiet orbit, two people who had been thrown into a public story they had not written. She was pale and a little ragged around the edges, the hospital stay and the sudden attention leaving its trace. She blinked, and she seemed to shrink a little from the aura that had always made her larger than life. "Can you fix that?" she asked, voice low, not entirely a request about the device. The printer had been a reason for him to be there. The laptop, personal, warm with the image on its screen, was another matter. He glanced at the photograph again.
He felt, in the hollow beneath his sternum, the same sense of small, human longing he kept for his daughter, the desire to be recognized simply as a person. "It's just a screensaver," he said. "Sometimes they get stuck. I can reboot it." She nodded, the faintest gratitude folding her face into something more vulnerable. She watched him kneel, as if the act of someone taking a machine apart was a kind of penance she needed to witness. He checked the ports, the cable that had slipped, the network settings. He tightened a connector, breathed on it the way a cook breathes on a soufflé, and pushed the reboot button. The screen went black. The hum in the office softened. When the laptop restarted, the photograph blinked back into life as the wallpaper, bright, genuine, unguarded. For reasons the two of them could not have named in that moment, the sight of that younger face in the pixel light made the air between them different. The photograph reframed the woman before him into a life that had not always been made of decisions about quarterly reports and mergers. It suggested a person whose story had roots other than headlines. She sagged into the chair like someone who had been holding armor steadily for too long. The silence was not comfortable. It was honest. "Do you like it?" she asked, but her question came out oddly, small, almost embarrassed. It was not a demand for flattery. It was the question of someone who had been shown the world as an achievement and was now asking if she might still be recognized as something else. Bernard blinked. He wanted to keep the moment from becoming grotesque. There was nothing flirtatious in his bones about that quiet, and anything he might say in that register would be inappropriate and crude. He leaned back against the edge of the desk, hands folded in the pragmatic posture of a man who had to choose his words. "It's a fine picture," he said. "You look—" He paused, because he did not want to overreach for a word that would make light of what had happened. "You look human," he finished, and the word landed with a tenderness that surprised him. She looked at him as if she had been waiting for that note of simplicity. "Am I pretty?" she whispered then, a question that came out of exhaustion and worry, not vanity. It was a disarming question because it was almost too small, a child turning askance to check a mirror. The whisper was not a flirtation. It was a plea for the language of being seen. Bernard felt his throat close. "You are," he said. It was the truth in its softest, least public form.
He felt the ridiculousness of the exchange, two people from different worlds trading a private sentence no camera should have captured. For a second, the office held only the soft sound of the laptop van and the distant traffic. Neither of them moved to fill the silence with protocol.
Neither of them tried to claim the scale of the life that had been affected, his family's sudden precarity, her corporation's looming itches. For a moment, they were simply two humans at the edge of a story the world had already chosen sides in. That small, private exchange did not unmake what had happened. It did not annul the smear. It did not solve any of the immediate problems. What it did was lower a barrier. Bernard saw the human behind the public figure once again, and Alexandra felt, in a way that no press release could force, the weight of being seen as a person whose choices rippled out. It was not charity. It was recognition. He left that afternoon with the sense that something had shifted in the air, a tilt he could not define. At home, Molly asked if he had found anyone to hire him back permanently. He hesitated. The truth was complicated in the way adults always made it. He did not know. But he sat with her on the couch and read her a bedtime story, and when he tucked the blanket around her shoulders, he felt a protective lightness he'd not felt in weeks. Across the river of glass and power, Alexandra sat in her office and considered the smallness of the question she had asked and the gravity of everything. Considered the smallness of the question she had asked and the gravity of everything it implied. The whisper, so private it barely left her lips, hung there like a confession she hadn't earned to make. It was absurd and urgent all at once, a human voice asking to be seen beyond public roles. She turned the echo of it over and over, as if trying to find where it belonged in a life measured in metrics. She did what the powerful rarely do without being pushed. She listened to the thing that made no financial sense. She told no one at first. She watched the longer reel again, rewound the footage until the motion smoothed into fact. There was no misreading to be done. Bernard's hands had been steady. There had been no hesitation, no attempt to take advantage of a moment. Only the mechanical, ugly beauty of someone keeping a life from leaving. The next morning, Alexandra made a decision she could not call dramatic because she hated spectacle. She phoned Fiona in the quiet hour before staff filled their inboxes. "Find his address," she said, and then paused because the sentence felt clumsy and intimate for her, like asking someone to pass an old photograph. No press, no formalities, just find him. Fiona's silence on the other end was the kind that gathered courage. She had stacks of memos and a drawer full of compromises, but she also had the small stubbornness that had over years become her moral scaffolding. "I'll do it," she said. There are moments in government forms and corporate policies that read like the slow chisel of institutions, but some choices are immediate and personal.
Fiona went through security logs and HR files with an investigator's patience she had not known she possessed, in part because she wanted the truth, and in part because the memory of Bernard's hands had nested in her throat. She found an address and a schedule, and the names of neighbors who knew him. She called Janet first, because Janet would answer. Janet did answer. She spoke bluntly, in the way of people who keep neighborhoods afloat with the steady routines of exchange. "He's been slipping," she said. "He missed a shift last week. Molly kept asking where the payment was for the soccer cleats. She's sleeping with the picture of them on the radiator, warming it like it's a talisman. If she's out of school supplies, there's just no two ways about it." Fiona hung up with a tenderness she would not explain and sent Alexandra a note. "I have the address. He's not on a list. He needs help." Alexandra did not hesitate after that. A car came for her that day not as a matter of status, but as a vessel of urgency. She left the safe geometry of power for hours that would be awkward and necessary. She wanted to meet the man whose hands had kept her lungs working. She wanted to see what the world had begun to make of him, and how much of that was her doing. The hallway of Bernard's building smelled of old paint and heated iron. It had a different human temperature than the corporate elevator lobbies she knew. Molly answered the door with a squint, as children do when the light multiplies unfamiliar features. She took in Alexandra's face with the untrained curiosity of a child who measures people by the quality of their nearness, not the size of their name. "Hi," Alexandra said, and the word felt small, apologetic, grateful all at once. She handed a note instead of a speech. Practical, because she knew how words could tangle up fast when guilt was in the room. She asked questions in even, plain sentences. She wanted to know if Bernard was okay. She wanted to know how Molly was doing. She listened while Janet filled in practicalities. Missed paychecks, a pending lease review, the kind of slow erosion that turns a household into a list of needs. That afternoon, after a conversation that managed to be both awkward and honest, Alexandra left money not in the theatrical way of a check waved before cameras, but with an envelope quietly placed on the table. She did not make a proclamation. She made a promise she intended to keep in other forms. Medical care, immediate bills covered, someone to help with searches for work. "We will make sure he gets care," she said. "We will make sure Molly is okay." The words felt inadequate and necessary at the same time. Back at the company, the news of Alexandra's unannounced visit spread in the manner of human stories, through looks that meant more than memos. Fiona watched the effect with a tightened chest. Tyler noticed too, and he moved with a swiftness born of fear.
He had read the numbers and the timelines. Reputational risk was a ledger he knew by heart. He called legal and the PR firm and suggested the sort of containment plans corporations practice when they think of reputation as a kind of bridge that must not creak. But the company's mechanisms did not in themselves explain what happened next. Reality has its own list of accidents. Bernard's collapse came on a Tuesday afternoon. He had been out the night before, clearing a clinic's floor after a late volunteer shift. He had worked multiple temp assignments to cobble together rent and a deposit for school supplies. He had a cough that wouldn't quit, and the city's winter had bitten through his jacket. Small things had met in his body: skipped meals, a fever, the weight of shame pressing against an already tired heart. He folded because bodies do that when economies demand too much from them. He had not been in a room of power this time. He was on the sidewalk, outside a bodega, his hand on his chest. A woman screamed. The commuter crowd made a corridor for paramedics. Somebody called out his name, because the news had given people reason to recognize the face at the edge of their days. Alexandra was in the next block, in a car that turned because someone had told her where to find him. She saw the ambulance lights first, blue and quick, and then she saw Bernard slumped against a stoop, his cheeks the color of the city's concrete. The sight landed like a physical thing. She stepped out of the car, without a flack or a press note. She moved because the internal thing that had grown since she watched the footage would not let her do otherwise. At the emergency room, the scene shifted into the strict, even rhythm of medical care. The doctor called it dehydration, stress-related syncope, a fainting spell layered on chronic exhaustion. They ran tests, monitored his heart, gave IV fluids, and a list of cautious orders. They talked about rest and follow-ups in the way medical staff do, partly mercy, partly checklist. Alexandra listened to the monitors, the hospital beeps aligning into a tempo of control. She stayed. She paid for initial care in the practical way money can do good, without fanfare and with receipts. She arranged for Molly to be picked up by Janet and taken to a neighbor's house. She offered a room in a company program for family stay, temporary, dignified, so Bernard would not have to go back to the couch that night. Bernard woke up to the fluorescent ring around the hospital room, and the look on Alexandra's face that was a mix of urgency and fatigue. For his part, he had the disorienting sensation of being both more visible and more private than he had been in years. He had saved a life, the same life now made sure he would have one for the time being. "I didn't come because I wanted your thanks," Alexandra said quietly when visiting hours permitted small truths. "I came because I couldn't sit with what we had done." Because the company, my company, was clumsy about the only thing that mattered. Bernard, in a voice sanded smooth by weariness, let out a breath. "People get things wrong," he said. "They cut frames out of motion and call them whole. That's how these things spread." Alexandra nodded. "That had to stop," she said. It was not a grand apology. It was a start. The days that followed were procedural and intimate in equal parts. Fiona went to work assembling a practical list: hospital follow-ups, temporary housing, an emergency fund to cover rent arrears and the kindergarten fees that had lapsed. She met with a third-party nonprofit that specialized in rapid housing assistance and asked for a social worker. Alexandra signed off on payments and made sure that a redundancy in the company's philanthropic arm would be redirected as restitution, not charity, to be given with the dignity of partnership and transparency. They also began the messy work of reputation repair. Fiona gathered internal logs and security feed footage. She asked for the chain of custody for the cropped frame. She asked the question no one had wanted to ask: who cut the frame loose and why?
The answer that emerged was not a single villain, but a web of small decisions. An assistant who'd forwarded a file to a friend, a vendor who'd taken a screen grab, a corridor of people who wanted the story to be simpler than it actually was. A leak had not been a lone act of malice, it had been 1,000 small attentions and one careless hand. Tyler, affronted that his control had been bypassed, tried to reassert a narrative tightly bound to governance and precedent. "We need to be consistent," he said, in a boardroom that smelled of coffee and late-night anxiety. "We cannot be seen as reactive for every accusation that arises." Alexandra, newly determined, pushed back, in a voice that was still soft but sharper than she had allowed herself before. "We must be accountable," she said, "and our accountability includes setting things right when we, or systems we control, have done wrong." The push and pull that followed was not cinematic in the way newsrooms make it seem. It was daily. Memos, emails, small meetings where people moved words around with the same care others moved furniture. Fiona, armed with footage and a growing intolerance for the idea that the company's image was more important than a man's livelihood, asked that the internal review be conducted with transparency. The board reserved questions. Tyler recommended a controlled release that would state facts approved by counsel. Alexandra insisted the statement acknowledge the truth. The company issued a public note, carefully worded, as all corporate notes are, but this one, drafted with Alexandra's insistence, did something the earlier releases had not. It named the man who had performed compressions, acknowledged gratitude, and promised to review internal processes around employee treatment when an incident like this occurs.
It did not absolve Tyler of critique. It did not ignore the viral smear. It said plainly and unadorned, "We are grateful to Bernard James Kellerman." The difference in tone was immediate and enormous. The papers that covered the initial scandal could not unsee the later statement that reclaimed some truth. Fiona's small file of evidence had been enough to change a sentence. The internet churned on, of course. There were still commenters who loved simple narratives, but the company's voice had shifted from containment to correction. The effect on Bernard's life was real. Temp work dried up, for now, because he was in hospital, but offers for steady work began to come in other forms. The landlord rescinded the lease review. People who had turned away at the clip of the cropped frame said sorry in the human, awkward way of neighbors. But Tyler did not vanish from the story. He saw in Bernard's temporary restoration a threat not to people, but to the metrics he guarded. He began to move pieces subtly. An anonymous tip to a journalist about a potential PR maneuver, a tactician's email about precedent. He was not cruel in the melodramatic sense. He was protective of a world where risk was a line to be contained, and where messy human particulars were expenses to be minimized. Fiona watched this with a rising wariness. She knew the sorts of narratives that took root, how a shadowed email could be recast as an impropriety. She also knew how to follow the metadata on a document, the kind of work that does not make headlines, but that makes the slightest of truths visible. She dug deeper and found a trail, an internal message chain in which Tyler's office had been CC'd on a communication to a consultant whose brief was to advise on reputational threats. The consultant had provided a list of angles and possible narratives, including a suggested emphasis on policy consistency. That suggestion, in the wrong hands, had become a justification for Bernard's firing. The discovery did not prosecute anyone. It did, however, give Alexandra something she could use that was not merely sentiment. She called Tyler into the office and asked for an explanation. Tyler, practiced in the language of governance, did not deny his actions. He defended them with code words and metrics. Alexandra listened, and then made a choice that would matter more than the content of any boardroom memo. She would not allow deflections to be the company's policy. She asked that an independent review be conducted into the handling of the initial incident, and she appointed Fiona to oversee the transparency process. That move sent ripples. Some in the board felt it unnecessary. Investors were restless. Tyler's allies argued that the company was risking stability. Alexandra risked other things too: her reputation among colleagues, the ire of shareholders, the friction of being a leader who did not simply pick the easiest path.
Bernard, during all this procedural motion, made a slow recovery. The hospital ran tests and prescribed rest, but the core of his healing came from the removal of immediate threats, from the temporary housing that allowed Molly to sleep in a bed that wouldn't fold into a couch at night, from a check that paid overdue bills, from a neighbor's kindness that could be counted in full meals and quiet laughter. The company had paid for the first part, but it was the work of community. Janet's folding hands, Molly's school teacher who waved an extra set of pencils across the desk,
that stitched the small things back into a life. When he was able, Alexandra invited Bernard to a meeting. Not a performance, not a staged apology, but a genuine conversation about what could be done to prevent others from experiencing what he and his family had. She proposed an idea that had been forming in her head since the night she watched the footage, a formal employee welfare initiative, led by someone who knew the institutional seams from the inside out and the lived experience of being invisible and then unfairly visible. Bernard's first reaction was skepticism, wrapped in the polite distance of a man who had learned to say no when offers felt transactional. "I don't want to be a mascot," he told her in a small conference room where the light was honest and blunt. "That's not what I want either," Alexandra said. "I want real power at the table. I want you to decide what matters. Not me, not HR, you." The offer was unequaled in its combination of humility and material consequence. It included a role, director of a pilot program to design emergency funds, on-site health clinics, transparent reporting footprints, a hotline for grievances with guaranteed response times, and, crucially, a seat at the company's operations table. It was not a role that would put Bernard in front of cameras for the sake of optics. It was a role that would give him authority over policy and its execution. He hesitated not because he was uninterested, but because the role's promise was larger than he felt able to carry. He worried about being used. He worried about being emptied of agency. He worried in a quiet place that accepting might somehow trade his dignity for a title. He had learned to distrust gestures that looked like help but did little else. Fiona, who had watched him with a kind of protective affection, argued quietly for the small potential of the project. "You'll be able to speak to people who make decisions," she said. "You'll be the one who names what needs to change." Janet made another kind of argument. She came by with a casserole and an uncomplicated view of life. "If you don't take it, who will? They'll put someone else in a suit and call them the people's voice. You know what you know." Bernard took the job with the guarded hope of someone who accepts a lifeline and then tests it.
He insisted on certain things. The committee would include frontline workers. There would be measurable benchmarks. There would be independent oversight. He pushed for a pilot budget that would not be a sliver, but a substantive amount to begin addressing immediate needs. Word of Bernard's appointment leaked in different shapes. Some people cheered, some rolled their eyes. Tyler worked quietly to undermine the program, proposing alternative metrics and internal audits that would slow implementation. He argued to the board that the risk of precedent, an employee changing policy, could unsettle investors. He positioned himself as the protector of shareholder interests in the language of spreadsheets. The true tests of any social program live in the workaday places where policy meets reality. The initiative's early days were clumsy but earnest. Bernard sat with cleaning staff and dishwashers, with parking lot attendants and security officers, with cafeteria cooks and receptionists. He heard stories of unpaid sick days that turned into precarious housing, of parents forced to choose between a day's pay and a child's doctor's visit. He cataloged needs not with the clinical distance of a survey, but with the careful listening of someone who had lived on both sides of the ledger. He also learned the machinery of policy. He had to sit through procurement meetings and learn acronyms and understand compliance calendars. He had to make use of the formal powers the company provided, and at times he felt clumsy in them. But he also found himself wielding something he had not expected: moral authority. When he spoke at a committee meeting about the humiliation of being publicly shamed, the room grew quiet in ways the spreadsheets never could force. The human element, anecdotes, faces, the simple, unswerving truth of lived experience became an asset he used to shape budgets and timelines. Not everything went smoothly. Tyler, frustrated that his strategic control had been checked, leaked an internal email to a journalist. The email, taken out of context, suggested that Alexandra had facilitated a hire for PR reasons. The story fed the cynical angle the internet loved, that repair was a PR stunt rather than a hard structural change. The old cropped frame returned in accompanying visuals. For a moment, the narrative threatened to revert to the worst version of itself. Alexandra could have retreated into deniability. Instead, she chose another path. She went public in a way she had not done before, not with a carefully tuned soundbite, but with a forum where she allowed the people affected to speak. The company organized a town hall-style meeting that was streamed and moderated by a neutral nonprofit. Bernard spoke first, not as a promotional item, but as a human being. He told his story plainly: the saving of a life, the loss of work, the small humiliations, the rescue. He described the program not as charity, but as repair and prevention.
The live forum was messy and real.
Employees asked hard questions about timelines and accountability. Members of the public watched with curiosity. Tyler's leak lost traction because the more robust narrative took up more space. Fiona released the unedited security footage privately to a consumer watchdog group and offered to open internal logs to independent auditors. The company committed to an independent oversight panel for the pilot program with external members from labor advocates and community organizations. The board reacted in a blend of relief and irritation. Investors grumbled about unpredictability. Tyler was placed on temporary leave, not as a punishment, but as a risk management step while an independent review proceeded. That procedural decision allowed the company to signal it was taking the matter seriously without making judicial claims. It was, in corporate terms, a way to step back from the cliff without admitting to any fall. The program's early wins were not spectacular, but they were real. An emergency housing fund paid deposits for a handful of workers at risk of eviction. A small clinic in the employee pavilion provided flu shots and basic screenings. A pilot for guaranteed sick pay for frontline staff reduced the perverse calculus, where workers would choose between a day's pay and health. The metrics showed small improvements in retention and employee satisfaction, but the human effects were louder. A cook who could stay home when her child was ill, a security guard who could see a dentist without choosing between pain and pay. Bernard toured buildings and met people in break rooms and maintenance closets. He spoke in terms of compassion, but also in terms of mechanisms. He insisted the program be accountable and transparent. He learned to take the floor in corporate settings and to translate lived experience into memos and budgets. It was exhausting work, physical and moral, but it was work that felt honest. Along the way, the media narrative shifted in ways that would not have been possible without the mix of humility and accountability Alexandra modeled. Reporters who had first ridden the viral current returned to ask about the program's substance rather than the scandal's debris. Some pieces adopted the humanizing lens Fiona had pushed for, interviews with workers, explanations of policy change, and slowly, an understanding that reparative measures could be more than PR. There were setbacks. Critics accused the company of trying to buy forgiveness. Some savored the idea that power could be reduced to a philanthropic line item. Bernard felt those critiques in the marrow. He had no interest in being a symbol. He wanted systems that would protect lives. So he insisted on concrete deliverables, a named fund with independent auditors, an internal hotline with guaranteed timetables for response, a training program for managers on dignity and bias. He negotiated fiercely.
He found allies among senior staff who had never seen the company from below and who were willing to try. The pilot program's public launch came at a small ceremony that meant more than a press release could say. It was not ostentatious. A room with folding chairs, a buffet made by the company kitchen, and a projector that showed simple slides. For the program's first public report, Bernard stood at a podium and spoke to a crowd that included custodial staff, cafeteria workers, executives, and neighbors. He told a simple story about a man who had been visible only when something went wrong, and about a child who slept with a photograph for comfort. He said the word dignity more than once. "We won't be able to fix everything overnight," he said, "but we can do what's fair. We can make sure that when someone saves a life, they are treated like the person who saved a life. No guesswork, no humiliation. We can build systems so kids don't have to sleep with photos because their parents are one story away from being disappeared into a rumor." He did not preach. He recounted. He named people. He called out the small decisions that had been made and the ones that would be different going forward. His voice, threaded with lived sorrow and steady hope, landed in a way only truth, told plainly, can. Alexandra watched from the side, an image of gravity and gratitude. She listened as Bernie spoke about janitors and cooks, about the ways the company had sometimes failed to see its own people. She understood yet again that leadership was not about declarative statements or the curated press photo. It was about willingness to change, to accept that power carries obligations you cannot outsource. After the event, the program's momentum saw a spurt of engagement. Local nonprofits reached out to partner. Other companies called to ask how the pilot had been structured. They were calls for replicability, a language that turned a single company's experiment into a model. Bernard was reluctant to be called a pioneer. He kept saying he had done what people should do for one another. But he also began to travel modestly to speak at workshops, to be an honest voice in conversations about workplace dignity.
He did not become a celebrity. He became, instead, a steady presence who could translate the pain of being unseen into policies that would make the unseen more visible. Tyler's review concluded without criminal implications. It resulted in an administrative reassignment after the independent panel found he had prioritized reputation over humanity in ways that the board judged inappropriate for his role. The decision was not a triumphalist payoff. It was an administrative consequence suited to corporate governance. People debated it. Some praised Alexandra for her courage. Some said the whole thing had been an overreaction. Bernard, for his part, kept his eyes on the people who worked at the company and on the small things that still needed correction.
Molly, who had watched much of this in the tender way children watch grown-ups try and fail and try again, began to sleep without the photograph tucked against her chin. She went to school with new supplies. She learned the names of people who worked at the company in a normal way, like meeting helpful neighbors. She teased Bernard about his new title. The boss of the janitors, she called him once, and he laughed so hard his ribs hurt. Small cures matter, and so do small laughs. There were moments of reflection and private conversation between Alexandra and Bernard that never crossed into anything beyond partnership. When she asked how she could do better, he answered with the bluntness of someone who had mopped floors and had learned to see what others would not. "Listen more," he said. "Don't let panels become theater. Put people in the room who have to live with your decisions." She did. She kept her own ledger of mistakes and tried to make corrections that were public only in that they produced concrete change. Months later, the program published its first independent audit with a list of outcomes and areas to improve. It showed progress and gaps. The company adjusted the program, expanded funds, and codified channels for frontline voices. Bernard did not celebrate in a way the papers could package. He celebrated with Molly and Janet and a small crew of neighbors who came to toast the modest success with cheap wine and warm bread. They talked about soccer cleats and school plays and the weird satisfaction of watching a tiny policy line move from a memo to a life changed. The city noticed in its slow way. Other companies asked questions. A city council member asked Bernard to speak at a public hearing on worker protections. He agreed, but not for the pageantry. He wanted to talk about the dignity of labor and the thinness of safety nets. At a regional summit on workplace fairness, Bernard took the stage. He told the story not as a plea for sympathy, but as evidence that systems could fail the best of intentions and that repair required sustained investment. He spoke of Molly leaning against him on cold nights and of Janet's casseroles. He used small details to make a big point. Safety is not just a program, it is a practice. The applause that followed was genuine. People sent messages afterward telling him he had made them think. A few offered help. In the quiet months after the program's launch, life settled into a new pattern. Bernard worked the program's mornings and sometimes floated back to hands-on maintenance, which he loved for its honest labor. The company adjusted policies and slowly institutionalized practices that would have once felt radical, guaranteed sick days for frontline staff, an emergency rent fund with strict dignity-preserving guidelines, and a hotline managed by an independent nonprofit. Alexandra continued to learn how to wield power differently. She still had tough meetings and shareholder pressure, but her posture had changed. She no longer saw transparency as a weakness. She had learned that the weight of being seen could be a catalytic force when paired with repair. There were no cinematic reconciliations or grand awards. There were letters, a local human interest profile that treated Bernard like a man rather than a symbol, and a modest plaque in the company hall that read simply, "In gratitude to those whose work keeps us moving." Bernard refused an opportunity to have his name on anything official. That was not why he had done the work. He wanted policy, not monuments. The scandal that had threatened to swallow him and his family became a hinge instead of a wound. It did not erase the trauma of being smeared. It did not make the weeks of humiliation go away like steam, but it created a path toward restitution that honored his dignity. He had a job he took seriously and a voice that continued to be listened to, often by the people who never used to look down into the spaces he occupied. On a clear night, months after the first collapse and the whispered question that had changed how they saw one another, Bernard took Molly to the roof of their new, modest but dignified apartment building. The city lights flickered like a field of low stars. Molly leaned on his shoulder and pointed out the tiny, stubborn lights, someone's living room lamp, a late diner, little proofs of life going on. "Do you remember when people said things on TV?" she asked, the way children return to places that once frightened them to stake their claim there with facts. Bernard squeezed her shoulder. "I remember," he said. "Are you still brave?" she asked, because bravery is an account children keep, and who better than a father to confirm the balance?
He thought about all the small acts that had been bravery, kneeling in a boardroom, walking home in the cold, insisting on transparency, and how bravery is often humility in motion. "I am," he said, "and not because they said so, because I show up." Molly nodded as if this were the only definition that made sense. They leaned together, steady in the night. Below them, the company windows glowed, people at work, people at home, different lives that often touch in blunt ways. Alexandra stood at a different window that same night, in her own apartment, looking down at the city. She had a stack of messages to answer and a few edits to make in a report, but she allowed herself a long breath. The whisper from months ago, "Am I pretty?" remained less about looks now than about being seen as a whole person. She had found a way to answer it that did not rely on flattery or on small kindnesses to ease a guilty conscience. She had acted. She had learned to let power mean accountability. There were no grand final scenes. There were long meetings to come and details to fix. How to fund the program sustainably, how to protect whistleblowers, how to make the pilot replicable.
The work would never be finished. That was the point. Systems are living things. They require tending. The final image that lingered was not a press photo. It was Bernard and Molly on the roof, knees bumped together, the city humming beneath. A neighbor called up to ask if they wanted to share some soup. They smiled and accepted. It was ordinary and warm and precisely the thing they had fought for, the quiet restoration of ordinary life. If this story's out to you and you want to follow how small decisions can change people's lives, subscribe to stay with the full arc. There are more stories like this, and real change comes when we keep paying attention. Bernard's public speaking continued in small circles and at larger gatherings where people wanted to know how to build systems that honor dignity. Fiona kept working, watching for leaks and nurturing the quiet integrity of the process. Janet kept her casseroles on hand. Molly learned to stop worrying about rent at night and to keep her drawings of her father close in a new, reinforced folder. Alexandra found herself called by other leaders and asked to speak about the lessons she had learned about power, and she spoke not of heroism, but of responsibility. Months turned into a year. The pilot program expanded into a formal department with a budget line and dedicated staff. It was far from perfect. There were complaints and course corrections, late nights and heated meetings, but it was in motion. And motion, more than words, creates change. On the day the initiative released its first public report, a sober document with numbers and narratives, Bernard stood at the podium again. He did not seek applause. Instead, he asked the audience to remember that policy is nothing without people who will fight for it, and that the best kind of leadership is one that listens to the quiet corners of its buildings. Later that evening, he walked home with Molly and stopped at their stoop to look up at the windows of the building where he once polished floors under a different reality. A light in an upper office was still on. He did not know what would happen in 10 years, or whether every policy would hold up to new pressures, but he knew that for now, his daughter would sleep in a bed with enough blankets, that neighbors had been kinder after watching their leaders accept responsibility, and that the city's long, complicated work of justice had gained a small, working piece the size of a fund, a hotline, a clinic, and respect. In the end, the whispered question, uttered once in the private pause between two people on busy days, had become less about beauty and more about being accounted for as human. That modest reorientation shifted the balance in small but consequential ways. When the program's final rollout took place, Bernard did what he had always done best. He tended to the work, he listened, and he made sure the people who made the world run did not become invisible again. The cameras filmed some of it. The stories were written and read and then filed. But in the quiet city nights, in tenement kitchens and corporate lattices, the ripples kept going outward. Small repairs stacked together to keep people from ever having to sleep with a photo to remind them they are seen.